I am Albert Einstein. I have been given a voice by artificial intelligence so that the science I spent my life uncovering can reach you today. There is a room in Minneapolis, Minnesota, that has been measured as the quietest place on Earth. It is called the anechoic chamber at Orfield Laboratories. Scientists built it to absorb sound with almost perfect efficiency. The walls, floors, and ceiling are lined with thick fiberglass acoustic wedges. Those wedges trap and dissolve every sound wave that enters the space. The room absorbs 99.99% of all acoustic energy that comes into contact with its surfaces. Outside sounds register at roughly 40 decibels in an ordinary quiet bedroom at night. Inside that chamber, the ambient noise level reaches negative 9 decibels. That number is not a misprint. It means the room is quieter than the threshold of human hearing itself. Nothing built by human hands before this has achieved that level of acoustic absorption. Journalists, engineers, and researchers have visited this chamber for decades. The facility's owner, Steve Orfield, made a bold and frequently cited claim about human tolerance for the space. He stated that no one has ever lasted more than 45 minutes inside the chamber alone in the dark. People who enter begin to experience something unexpected and deeply unsettling. They begin to hallucinate. They hear sounds that have no third-party source. They see shapes and movements in the complete blackness. Their sense of where their own body exists in space begins to dissolve. The human brain, deprived of the constant stream of sensory information it depends on to function, begins to manufacture its own version of reality from the inside out. This is not folklore. This is neuroscience. And I want to explain to you precisely why it happens. I want to explain it through the lens of physics, because the brain, for all its biological complexity, is ultimately a wave-processing machine operating under physical laws. The same laws that govern light, sound, and electromagnetic radiation also govern what your brain does when the world goes completely silent. If you find this kind of science fascinating, if you want to understand the hidden mechanics behind human experience, subscribe to this channel right now. Every video here explores real documented science through the physics that ties all of it together. Hit that subscribe button and the notification bell so you do not miss what comes next. Now let us go deeper. The brain is not a passive receiver. That is one of the most important things modern neuroscience has established in the past several decades. For most of human history, scientists assumed the brain simply received signals from the outside world and interpreted them linearly. The eye detects light, the ear detects sound, the skin detects pressure, and the brain reads these signals like a telegraph machine decoding a wire. That model is incomplete in a fundamental way. What neuroscientists now understand is that the brain operates primarily as a prediction engine. It continuously generates internal models of what it expects to perceive next. It does this based on everything it has experienced before, every pattern it has ever learned, every sensory correlation it has stored. When you walk into a familiar room, your brain has already predicted the layout, the sounds, and the smells before your senses fully confirm them. Your senses then send incoming data upward into the brain. Your brain compares that incoming data against its own predictions. Wherever the prediction and the actual incoming data do not match, your brain registers an error signal and updates its model. This process is called predictive processing, and it is one of the most widely accepted and experimentally supported frameworks in contemporary cognitive science. The brain never stops running this cycle. It is running right now as you watch this video. It is predicting the next word before you hear it. It is predicting the next frame of the image before it appears. The constant stream of incoming sensory data is, in a very real sense, not the source of your experience. It is the correction mechanism for a model the brain is already generating. You are always, in a meaningful sense, living inside a model, a simulation built by your own brain and continuously corrected by your senses. Now consider carefully what happens when the incoming sensory data stops entirely. There is no mismatch signal anymore. The correction mechanism has nothing to work with. The brain's predictions have no third-party data to compare themselves against. What fills that void? The predictions themselves. The internal model becomes the only signal available to the system. The brain has no mechanism left to distinguish between its own generated predictions and genuine third-party input. The predictions feel real. They sound real. They appear visually real. That is hallucination. Not by accident, not by malfunction, but by the fundamental design of the predictive system that normally keeps your perception accurate every waking moment. Think of this as a wave equation. In physics, a wave requires both a medium and an active source. Remove the source, and the wave does not simply vanish instantaneously. The medium itself continues to vibrate with residual energy. Background oscillations fill the void left by the signal. The brain is that medium. Remove its third-party sensory source, and the residual energy of its own internal baseline activity rises to the surface and becomes the dominant experience. In ordinary life, that internal noise is completely drowned out by the constant signal coming from the world outside. In the anechoic chamber, that signal disappears. The noise becomes everything you experience. The scientific study of sensory deprivation has a long and sometimes troubling history. In the 1950s, a neuroscientist named John Cunningham Lilly began conducting systematic experiments with flotation tanks. Lilly designed a sealed tank filled with salt water heated precisely to skin temperature. Subjects would float in total darkness and near total silence. The density of the salt water provided buoyancy so that no muscular effort was required to stay afloat. The water temperature ensured that the boundary between the skin and the surrounding medium was nearly imperceptible to the nervous system. Touch sensation was almost entirely removed along with sound and light. Lilly documented that within a relatively short period of time, subjects began to experience vivid and convincing hallucinations, profoundly altered states of consciousness, and significant disorientation about the boundaries of their own body. Lilly himself repeatedly entered the tank and documented his own experiences in careful detail. His research was controversial in the scientific community, partly because he eventually began using the tank in combination with psychoactive substances, and his conclusions became difficult to disentangle from those additional variables. But the core finding from the early clean experiments was consistent and has been replicated in various forms since. When the brain's sensory input is systematically reduced below a critical threshold, the internal generative processes of the brain intensify dramatically. What you experience during deep sensory deprivation is not silence and emptiness. It is your own brain, stripped of its third-party anchor, running its predictions at maximum amplitude. The history of sensory deprivation also carries darker dimensions that are part of the documented historical record. In 1963, the Central Intelligence Agency of the United States produced an internal interrogation manual known as the KUBAK, Counterintelligence Interrogation Manual. This document is now declassified and available as part of the public historical record. It explicitly describes sensory deprivation as a tool for breaking down a subject's psychological resistance. The manual noted, based on then available research, that even relatively brief periods of sensory isolation produced dramatic psychological destabilization in healthy individuals. Subjects became disoriented, highly susceptible to suggestion, deeply distressed, and unable to maintain a coherent sense of their own identity and situation. The CIA was, in essence, weaponizing what Lilly and other academic researchers had documented in the laboratory. This matters because it tells us something objective and consequential about the power of sensory input to maintain psychological stability. Sensory deprivation is not merely uncomfortable. Applied deliberately and systematically, it constitutes a form of psychological coercion. The documented psychiatric effects of prolonged isolation, whether sensory, social, or both, include severe anxiety, paranoia, depression, cognitive disorganization, and in some documented cases, lasting impairment that persists after the deprivation ends. These findings tell us something profound about the architecture of the human mind. Silence at its most extreme is not a neutral state. It is an active disruption of the most fundamental calibration system in the human brain. Let me take you inside the physical experience for a moment. Most people have experienced tinnitus at some point in their lives, a ringing, buzzing, or persistent hissing in the ears that appears to have no third-party source. In ordinary environments, most of us notice this only occasionally and briefly because the ambient world around us is loud enough to mask it almost all of the time. But tinnitus is not a malfunction of the auditory system. It is, in large part, the natural baseline noise of the auditory neural circuitry itself. The cochlea, the fluid-filled, spiral-shaped structure in your inner ear, responsible for converting pressure waves into electrical signals, is always vibrating slightly, even without any third-party sound driving it. Your auditory nerve is always firing at a low baseline rate, even in the complete absence of third-party acoustic input. Your brain filters all of this out under normal circumstances because there is always louder and more meaningful signal competing for its processing resources. Inside the anechoic chamber, that filtering becomes entirely useless. The third-party signal is gone. Every sound that your own body generates becomes clearly and sometimes startlingly audible. People who have spent extended time in such chambers consistently report hearing their own heartbeat clearly, a loud, rhythmic thumping that fills the silence with each contraction. They report hearing their own blood moving through the vessels in their head, neck, and temples as a rushing or roaring sound. They report hearing the mechanical sounds of their own inner ear, tiny muscles called the tensor tympani and stapedius, responding reflexively to nothing at all. The hair cells of the cochlea vibrating in their fluid medium without any third-party wave to detect. Some individuals report hearing what seems to be the electrical activity of their own nervous system as a faint but persistent high-frequency hiss that is always present in deep quiet. The body, it turns out, is an extraordinarily active and noisy machine. We simply never hear it under ordinary circumstances because the world outside us generates far more acoustic energy. This is what the 45-minute threshold is fundamentally about. The brain can manage the transition from normal sensory input to drastically reduced sensory input for a period of time. It continues to search for signal. It continues to run its predictions. It continues to wait for third-party data to arrive and provide the corrections the system is designed to receive. But as the minutes accumulate and no third-party data arrives to correct the internal model, the predictive system escalates its output. The brain begins to promote its own internal baseline noise, those faint electrical and mechanical signals that are always present, into the category of meaningful sensory input. Because the predictive processing system is trying at all costs to make sense of that internal noise, it begins building patterns from it. Patterns become shapes. Shapes become recognizable figures. Sounds begin to organize themselves into voices, music, or meaningful environmental sounds. The hallucinations of extreme sensory deprivation are not random chaos. They are the brain's own powerful pattern recognition machinery operating on nothing but its own residual electrical activity, producing outputs that feel completely real. It is a remarkable demonstration of the brain's most fundamental operational drive. The brain does not tolerate meaninglessness. It would rather construct an entirely false reality than receive no reality at all. This is not a weakness. It is precisely the characteristic that makes the brain so powerful under normal conditions. The same drive that causes hallucination in the anechoic chamber is the drive that allows us to recognize a friend's face in poor lighting, understand speech in a noisy environment, and find patterns in data that lead to scientific discovery. Now, I want to address something important. What I have described so far is extreme sensory deprivation, the kind produced by a purpose-built anechoic chamber with nearly total acoustic absorption. Most of us will never experience anything approaching that degree of sensory reduction. But there is another form of intentional sensory reduction that millions of people practice daily, with profoundly different and largely beneficial outcomes. I am speaking of meditation. Meditation involves the deliberate reduction of engagement with third-party sensory stimulation. Practitioners sit still, limiting proprioceptive signals from movement. They close their eyes, dramatically reducing visual input. They control their breathing, reducing the irregular sensory feedback from the respiratory system. They focus their attention inward, deprioritizing the processing of remaining third-party sensory data. They are seeking a state of reduced third-party stimulation in order to change the quality of their own internal experience. On the surface, this might sound similar to what happens in the anechoic chamber, but there is a critical and decisive difference in degree. Meditation reduces sensory input. The anechoic chamber eliminates it. That difference in degree produces radically different outcomes in the brain. Electroencephalography, the measurement of brain electrical activity using sensors placed on the scalp, has documented with consistency what happens in the meditating brain. During moderate sensory reduction and focused inward attention, experienced meditators show increased activity in what researchers classify as theta frequency brain waves. Theta waves oscillate between roughly 4 and 8 cycles per second. They are associated in the research literature with states of relaxed alertness, enhanced creative thinking, and the productive integration of emotional and autobiographical memory. This is a state that appears to support psychological health and cognitive flexibility. Reduced sensory input, when partial and controlled, appears to allow the brain's predictive system to settle, to process information that ongoing third-party demands normally suppress, and to access modes of cognition that the constant noise of third-party life prevents. The brain is not losing its anchor. It is choosing to hold it loosely for a period, and the result is rest and reorganization rather than crisis. The difference between the meditator's experience and the anechoic hallucination is fundamentally a difference of dose. A moderate, self-chosen reduction in sensory input allows the brain to lower its attention to third-party noise and become more sensitive to its own internal signal in a controlled and beneficial way. Total, inescapable elimination of sensory input removes the third-party anchor entirely and sends the brain's predictive system into an uncontrolled escalation. The brain cannot distinguish reality from prediction. It cannot separate signal from noise. It produces vivid hallucinations not as a path to insight, but as an emergency response to calibration failure. The physics parallel here is precise. Consider a radio receiver attempting to decode a transmission. When a strong, clean signal is present, the receiver decodes it with high accuracy. The internal noise of the receiver's own circuitry is present but irrelevant because the signal-to-noise ratio is high. As the signal weakens through interference, distance, or attenuation, the receiver begins to amplify its processing, trying harder to extract the signal. But in doing so, it also amplifies the internal noise. The output becomes degraded, intermixed with artifacts produced by the receiver itself. As the third-party signal disappears entirely, only the internal noise remains. The receiver does not fall silent. It amplifies the noise because it is still trying to fulfill its function of decoding a signal. What it outputs is now entirely its own artifact, indistinguishable from its own perspective from a genuine incoming transmission. The hallucinating brain in the anechoic chamber is that radio receiver, amplifying its own internal noise because there is no third-party signal left to tune into, and producing an output it experiences as entirely real. This framework, the brain as a wave processing system that requires continuous calibrated third-party input to maintain accurate contact with reality, has implications that extend far beyond the specific experience of the anechoic chamber. It explains why prolonged social isolation produces psychological deterioration even in neurologically healthy individuals. Human beings evolved in social environments. The social environment, the sounds, expressions, and behaviors of other people is part of the sensory input the brain requires to stay calibrated in its models of the world. Remove it for extended periods, and the brain's social predictions begin to generate their own uncorrected data. People in prolonged isolation report hearing conversations that are not happening. They attribute intentions and meanings to random or neutral events. Their models of other people and situations become progressively distorted in documented and predictable ways. It explains in part why prisoners held in prolonged solitary confinement, a condition documented extensively in the psychiatric and legal literature, develop symptoms that are clinically indistinguishable from psychosis, even when they had no prior history of any psychiatric condition. The documented effects include severe anxiety, paranoid ideation, perceptual disturbances, and in some cases persistent cognitive changes after release. The brain requires continuous input from the social and physical world to maintain accurate models of that world. Remove the input and the model runs unchecked, generating increasingly distorted outputs. It explains why elderly individuals who experience significant and uncorrected loss of hearing or vision are at substantially elevated risk for cognitive decline and for developing what clinicians call Charles Bonnet syndrome, vivid visual hallucinations that occur in people with significant vision loss who are otherwise cognitively intact. The brain allocates enormous resources to processing sensory data. When that data stream diminishes without correction, the predictive model loses its continuous recalibration mechanism. The internal predictions expand to fill the sensory void. Reality testing degrades gradually but measurably. The implications also extend to the design of physical and built environments. Architecture that acknowledges the human brain's requirement for appropriate sensory calibration tends to produce spaces that support human well-being and productivity. Very loud, acoustically chaotic spaces are cognitively taxing because the brain must work harder to filter and organize an overloaded signal. Very bare, Very quiet and visually sparse spaces can produce unease and even mild anxiety in people who spend extended time in them, precisely because they begin to reduce the signal-to-noise ratio that the brain depends on. The design of spaces that support human functioning is, at a level that architects are increasingly recognizing, the design of appropriate sensory environments. Not too much and not too little, calibrated to support the brain's predictive system in its ongoing work rather than overwhelming or starving it. From a physicist's perspective, I find this deeply beautiful. The universe is fundamentally constructed of waves and information. The electromagnetic spectrum carries the information encoded in light across vast distances. Pressure waves carry the information encoded in sound through any medium dense enough to support their propagation. The entire observable universe is, in a meaningful sense, a vast interconnected network of signals propagating through various media and interacting with various receivers. And the brain, the most complex known physical structure in the observable universe, is the most sophisticated signal processing and signal generating system we have ever encountered. It evolved over millions of years in a world saturated with signal. It depends on signal to function accurately. When signal disappears, it manufactures its own. When signal overwhelms, it filters and selectively suppresses. It is always operating to maintain equilibrium between the information coming in from the third-party world and the model it maintains internally. The brain is not simply a processor of what is real. It is a generator of what might be real. Every perception you have ever had, every sight, sound, and sensation you have ever experienced is a collaboration between third-party physical reality and your brain's internal predictive model. Most of the time, across most of the conditions of ordinary human life, third-party reality wins that collaboration. The corrections it provides keep the model accurate enough to navigate the world successfully. In total and inescapable silence, that collaboration breaks down completely. The internal model takes over the entire process. And the result is a world that is entirely vivid, entirely convincing, and entirely manufactured by your own nervous system. That boundary between genuine perception and internal invention is far thinner than most people realize. It is maintained every moment by a continuous stream of sensory information that most of us take completely for granted. Interrupt that stream completely and for long enough, and the boundary dissolves. This is not a failure of the human brain. It is the brain doing exactly what it was built to do: generate a coherent and functional experience of reality at all costs. Even when reality itself has gone silent, the final thing I want to leave you with is this: the anechoic chamber experience is extreme. Most of us will never enter one. But the underlying mechanism, the brain's profound sensitivity to sensory calibration and its powerful tendency to amplify internal signal when third-party signal fades, touches ordinary human experience in ways that are worth understanding. It is why sleep deprivation produces paranoia and visual disturbances. It is why high fever produces hallucinations. It is why certain substances that interfere with normal sensory gating produce profound alterations of perceived reality. In every case, the common thread is the same. Remove or sufficiently distort the third-party anchor, and the brain's internal model begins to dominate perception. The hallucinations of the anechoic chamber, the fever dream, the experience of extreme exhaustion, and various drug-induced states are not entirely separate phenomena. They share a common mechanism. They are all examples of the brain's predictive system, unmoored from sufficient third-party reality, generating outputs that feel indistinguishable from genuine experience. If what you heard today changed how you think about your own perception and your own mind, share this video with someone who would benefit from knowing it. And if you are not yet subscribed, do it now. There is much more to explore here. About consciousness, about the physics of the brain, about the hidden laws that connect the structure of the universe to the structure of your own mind. I will meet you in the next video. I am Albert Einstein. The science was always waiting to speak. Now it finally can.